Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story. The U.S.-China trade war is heating up. Beijing vowing to strike back after President Trump slapped an additional round of 10% tariffs on Chinese imports.
Okay, 10 plus 10. It's a second 10.
The U.S. is shifting its attention toward countering China in the Pacific, but is the Navy and its equipment up to the task?
This is the equipment of my parents' generation now that we're trying to use to fight the next generation of warfare.
And the U.S. is strongly condemning Thailand's return of 40 Uyghurs back to China. More on why Thailand is a top destination for people fleeing rights abuses inside China and why Thailand offers them hope. The gloves are coming off when it comes to U.S.-China trade. The Trump administration will impose more tariffs on Chinese goods next week. An additional 10% will be added to the 10% already in place. China vows to retaliate.
Beijing accused the United States on Friday of exerting tariff pressure and blackmail. That's after President Donald Trump's latest threat to slap on extra duty of 10% on imports from China. He cited a continued flow of fentanyl into the country. The fresh China tariffs, in addition to a tariff of 10% levied on February the 4th, coincide with the start of China's annual parliamentary meet next week. It's an event at which Beijing is expected to roll out its 2025 economic priorities. In its daily briefing on Friday, a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said Washington had used the fentanyl issue to insist on tariff pressure and blackmail. On Thursday, Trump said his proposed 25% tariffs on Mexican and Canadian goods would take effect on Tuesday, along with the extra duty of 10% on Chinese imports. The announcement leaves Beijing less than a week to publish countermeasures. Earlier on Friday, China's Commerce Ministry said it had some of the world's toughest anti-drug policies and highlighted the risks new tariffs would bring to global supply chains. Analysts say Beijing still hopes to strike a deal with the Trump administration, but trade talks have so far not materialized, and the White House is ramping up signs it's preparing for a wider economic decoupling from China.
President Donald Trump said on Thursday that his proposed 25% tariffs on Mexican and Canadian goods will go into effect on March 4th. He also threatened an extra 10% duty on Chinese imports, on top of the previous 10%. Trump's move addresses the fentanyl crisis in the U.S., which kills hundreds of thousands of Americans every year. Most precursors of the lethal drug come from China. Those largely get sent to Mexico, where they're processed by cartels and sent into the U.S. through both the northern and southern U.S. borders.
U.S. President Donald Trump said on Thursday that his proposed 25% tariffs on Mexican and Canadian goods will go into effect on March 4th as scheduled, because of what he said were drugs flowing into the U.S. from those countries.
The drugs continue to pour into our country, killing hundreds of thousands of people. We're losing substantially more than 100,000 people. I mean, dead. They're dead. The families are destroyed after that happens.
Trump also said he would impose an additional 10% duty on Chinese goods on that day.
It's 10 plus 10. In
10
case,
plus 10
was there confusion on that?
There was, sir, yeah.
Okay, 10 plus 10. It's a second 10.
Canadian and Mexican officials were due to meet with Trump administration counterparts in Washington on Thursday and Friday to try to forestall the tariffs, which could deal a serious blow to a highly integrated North American economy. Here's Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum.
The goal is to protect the trade treaty between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, and within this frame, see what actions to take to strengthen the three economies. So Mexican ministers in Washington have studied the matters thoroughly, and there have been previous discussions. So I hope we can reach an agreement, and on March 4th we can announce another thing.
Meanwhile, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said his country will have an immediate and extremely strong response if the U.S. imposes tariffs next week.
We will continue to do that work and do everything necessary to avoid these tariffs coming in. But like I said, if on Tuesday there are unjustified tariffs brought in on Canada, we will have an immediate and extremely strong response, as Canadians expect.
Trump's comments on the matter during his first cabinet meeting on Wednesday seem to suggest that he may push the deadline back for about 1 month until April 4th. Beijing, in a letter to U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, said China and the United States should address concerns in economic and trade fields through equal dialogue and consultation.
So just how many tariffs has Trump imposed on Chinese goods? Here's a quick breakdown. During his first term, he slapped 10 to 25% tariffs on over $300 billion worth of Chinese imports. Most of those tariffs are still in effect. Earlier this month, Trump added a 10% tariff to all Chinese imports, on top of levies that were already in place on some goods. Now, Trump is adding another 10% tariff on top of that, which is set to go into effect on March 4th. Turning to our nation's Defense Department, are we militarily ready to handle threats from foreign adversaries like China? NTD's Steve Lance spoke with Garrett Exner, board member of Veterans on Duty and former U.S. Marine Corps Special Operations Officer, for more.
Garrett Exner, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. Garrett, last Friday, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as well as the Chief of Naval Operations dismissed. How should we be understanding this? You know, a lot of people may be uneasy, not knowing if we're in good hands right now. Will it improve military readiness, and particularly against threats such as China?
I think it absolutely will improve military readiness. The president is the commander-in-chief. He has the right to appoint the people that he wants advising him and that are aligned to his vision for how American foreign policy should go. I will point out that he did nominate CQ Brown to be Chief of Staff of the Air Force prior to this, so I think he has been supportive of CQ Brown before, but I think right now, where he's at a different point in time, a different mindset for how America needs to engage with the world and confront China, and he's picking his advisors to go forward, a new Chief of Naval Operations and a new Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and that's exactly appropriate to what should be happening right now.
And speaking of top-down, you spent quite the career, 16 years in the United States Marines. Talk to us about the mentality and the state of mind of the rank and file when it comes to top-down leadership and how they view the president and then some of the top leadership.
Well, I think one thing I'd point out is that you're already seeing a bump in recruitment. I think people understand that there's a level of trust that has been reestablished with Secretary Hegseth and President Trump coming in and saying we care about the warfighter. From the bottom levels of the military, everyone feels, or there's a sentiment where there's a disconnect with the highest levels of command. That seems to be kind of washing away with a new Secretary of Defense that has a connection to the warfighters, that understands what it's like to be a young junior officer deployed on the borders of the frontier, fighting the wars of his nation. And now he's going out there, and you see him day after day engaging with young members of the military from all branches of service. I think it's very encouraging across the board.
Now, with DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, with their eyes set on the defense budget, roughly 8% annually over the next 5 years. It's an unprecedented internal audit of the Department of Defense, which is on the horizon. What areas of spending do you expect to be most affected or targeted with good intent?
Yeah, I think DOGE is doing exactly what they should do. There's a ton of fat to be cut in the Department of Defense. I think what Secretary Hegseth laid out the other day in his memo, that climate initiatives need to go away, DEI needs to go away. There's a number of legacy programs that need to be repurposed, and we need to take a wholesale look at where what's called our kind of security cooperation money, our military assistance money is going. For years, we've kind of scattered that resource across different areas, Africa, the Middle East, and not strategically focused it on allies and partners that are doing the right thing.
So to your point of these kind of bloated bureaucratic programs that are inside of the United States military, with your many years experience as a Marine Corps Special Operations officer, which roles or departments do you see to be truly essential for operational effectiveness and keeping us safe?
I think it's generally structured to support the strategy from the Secretary down. I think a larger area that the United States military needs to look at for cuts and reorganization would be in the structure of the geographic combatant commands. Right? I think broadly, the United States military needs a kind of new Goldwater Nichols, an understanding of how we divide the world up, We've set that up in the 80s. We drew arbitrary lines. Our enemies do not adhere to those lines. And now you have difficulty in coordinating across these lines to try to do the will and the work of the American people in foreign areas.
You've also warned that U.S. military equipment and munitions production is lagging far behind our adversaries, which is scary if you think about it. As the Pentagon trims excess spending, how can it simultaneously invest in modernizing our forces to maintain a competitive edge?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we need to do, right? It's not just cutting the fat, which there's a lot of it to cut, it's also building muscle. If you want a doctor and a piece of strength, then you need to build the strength to do it. And a lot of our large, big ticket items in the military, if we're looking at carriers, bombers, our nuclear arsenal, all of that is antiquated. It's Cold War era technology. We have 11 carriers. Only one of them is the newest Ford-class carrier. We'll get a second this year. But 10 of those are Nimitz-class carriers. The oldest one of those, the Nimitz, is from 1973 is when it was launched. This is the equipment of my parents' generation now that we're trying to use to fight the next generation of warfare. We're also behind on hypersonics, on AI, and drone warfare technology. Senator Wicker probably has the best plan on this, $200 billion over the next 2 years, invested into these key technologies to get us up to speed. So do the cuts, repurpose that and reinvest that money, but also make the strategic investment under Senator Wicker's plan and a few others in Congress that are supporting him to get a generational investment in DoD and finally build that strength to confront our enemies.
A lot of attention given to our greatest adversary right now, China's growing Navy. With our Navy right now, how can we continue to deter adversaries like China? And do you believe that future administrations will provide the necessary resources?
Well, I know this administration is going to provide the necessary resources, and I assume that another Republican administration would provide the necessary resources. I get a little nervous about the commitment of Democrats in this area, and there's I think a shrinking number that would support strategic investment in DoD. China is a growing problem. They've been a growing problem for the last 30 years, and we've stood by and kind of let them continue to grow their influence and malign intent, particularly on the naval side of things. Just this week, we saw a vast fleet of Chinese, I'll use quotes to say that they're a fishing fleet. They're not. They're maritime militia, many of them, and they're off the coast of Argentina. They're in the Western Hemisphere, stealing resources from sovereign nations in the Western Hemisphere, and nobody has the ability to counter them. Our Navy right now is the smallest it's been since 1916. We need to upgrade our shipbuilding capacity. We need to be able to replace our ships as they go down for maintenance, and we need to build new ships at a higher capacity at scale. That requires investment, and I hope that this administration and subsequent Republican administrations would do that over time.
Garrett Exner, really appreciate you joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
Coming up, the U.S. is strongly condemning Thailand's return of 40 members of the Uyghur ethnic group back to China. More on why Thailand is a top destination for people fleeing rights abuses inside China and why Thailand offers them hope. China sending a warning to Taiwan: we will come to invade sooner or later. This as a top U.S. commander warns that Beijing is rehearsing its strategy for attacking the island. And tech giant Nvidia signals there's booming demand for its AI chips, allaying concerns that China's AI chatbot DeepSeek could steal the show. More on that after the break here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. A strong reaction from the top U.S. diplomat. Secretary of State Marco Rubio on Thursday condemning Thailand returning 40 members of the Uyghur ethnic group to China, where they have faced what the U.S. has formally called genocide. The Uyghurs are a Muslim minority group living in China's western Xinjiang region. The U.S. says Beijing is committing genocide against the Uyghurs through mass detention and forced sterilization. In a statement, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the U.S. condemns Thailand's repatriation in the strongest possible terms, adding the U.S. is alarmed by the country's action as a long-standing ally. The UN Human Rights Office also condemned the move, calling it a clear violation of international human rights laws. The Uyghurs held in Thailand were part of a group of 300 who were arrested in 2014 and fled China. Thailand is a top destination for people looking to escape persecution inside China. That's including Falun Gong practitioners, a faith group that's been brutally persecuted in China since 1999. Chinese authorities often refuse to issue passports for members of faith groups. Risking their lives, some have resorted to fleeing to Thailand, applying for asylum there from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and then waiting for a third country to receive them. China's defense ministry threatened Taiwan on Thursday, stating, quote, "We will come and get you sooner or later." This comes as Taiwan said it would do more military exercises as its forces prepare for a potential Chinese invasion. China has been staging drills off Taiwan's coast more regularly. The commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Fleet has warned that Beijing is using the exercises as a rehearsal for taking the island. The Chinese Communist Party sees Taiwan as part of China, despite never having ruled it. The regime has pledged to take the island under control by force if necessary. The U.S. doesn't have formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan, but sells weapons to the island so it can defend itself. Earlier this week, President Trump declined to comment on whether the U.S. would provide support if Taiwan was attacked. Secretary of State Marco Rubio reaffirmed the U.S. stance on Taiwan. He said the U.S. won't abandon the island and opposes aggression directed toward it. A Hong Kong court sentenced former pro-democracy lawmaker Lam Cheuk-ting and 6 others to prison for rioting on Thursday after they were attacked by a mob in 2019.
More than 100 white-shirted men stormed the Yuen Long train station in the city's northwest on the night of July 21st that year, attacking protesters, journalists and passers-by with clubs and sticks. Around a dozen attackers were later jailed for rioting and conspiring to wound with intent. But in a twist that stoked public outrage, Lam and the other 6 who were seen trying to defend the public that night were also arrested and charged with rioting. Lam had ended up with head and arm injuries that required stitches. In handing down his 37-month sentence, the judge noted Lam had not engaged in violent acts, but he said Lam's presence as a prominent Democrat and his live streaming of the attack had inflamed the situation. It created a magnet effect that drew more people to the scene, the judge said. Lam is already serving a nearly 7-year prison term in a separate national security case. He will serve 34 months of Thursday's rioting sentence after that term finishes. The 6 other defendants were given between 25 and 31 months in prison. Many of them sought mitigation on the grounds of self-defense, but the judge said they had engaged in riotous behavior, including throwing water bottles and spraying water from fire hoses. In 2020, after a year of mass protests, China imposed a sweeping national security law on Hong Kong, which has a separate legal system. Authorities have since arrested scores of activists, shut down media outlets, and overhauled elections to weed out the opposition. Democracies around the world have condemned the crackdown, but Beijing says all are treated equally under the security law and that it has brought stability.
Booming demand for high-end artificial intelligence chips is still intact. American chipmaker Nvidia said orders for its new Blackwell semiconductors were, quote, amazing. This comes after Chinese AI company DeepSeek emerged in the public last month and caused concerns that its self-proclaimed cost-effective AI models could reduce demand for Nvidia's high-end chips.
Nvidia's boss says there's still life in the AI boom. The company posted an upbeat growth forecast for its first quarter Wednesday, helping to soothe worries that demand for Nvidia hardware would cool off after DeepSeek burst onto the scene. Last month, the Chinese AI startup claimed it developed AI models at a fraction of the cost of Western rivals like OpenAI. The shock saw Nvidia lose $593 billion in market value, the largest one-day loss for any U.S. company. However, in an earnings call Wednesday night, CEO Jensen Huang said orders for Nvidia's new flagship Blackwell AI chips were, quote, amazing, and that booming demand for AI chips was intact. Nvidia expects a total revenue of $43 billion for the first quarter, compared with analysts' estimates of just under $41.8 billion. But the Santa Clara-based chipmaker says gross margins will be slightly lower. That's due to the costly and complicated ramp-up of the Blackwell chips. Earlier this week, a Reuters exclusive said Chinese companies are buying up Nvidia's H20 chips at record rates due to booming demand for DeepSeek's low-cost AI. Those chips are capped in power as part of US sanctions. The Trump administration is now considering restrictions on H20 sales to China. Speaking to Reuters, co-founder of IDX Advisors Ben McMillan said potential extreme measures under the Trump administration, such as capping the quantity or types of Nvidia chips to China, could be a real concern to the AI powerhouse.
I think the bigger concern is that if it does get more extreme, you might see China start to reduce demand and pivot to internally sourced chips, or again just something out of what we saw with DeepSeek, where they just figure out how to do more with the lower tier Nvidia chips, which aren't banned.
In more positive news for Nvidia, its Spectrum X Ethernet for networking was chosen for Trump's Stargate data center project, according to CFO Colette Kress. Nvidia shares bounced between gains and losses in extended trading Thursday, after closing up 3.7% in regular trading, while the news seemed to put a rally in China and Hong Kong over DeepSeek on pause, with stocks broadly falling.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For on-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you soon.